I cleaned off my desk a little bit and I'm feeling much better about that. And I'm going to drink my second tonic water today. Still have 2 others in the fridge, different flavors, different brand. And this one is cucumber mint tonic. And again, it has that ingredient, which is quinine sulfate, which I'm kind of interested in. This one's kind of nice. A bit less of a reaction probably because I tried the other one the other day. And something really interesting happened yesterday. I went to the coffee shop to visit my friend that owns it, and we were chatting a little bit after he closed up, and he was talking about something about how people should be able to afford to live in the city that they work in. And that's really a problem where I live. The housing prices are astronomical right now. And so then I told him about that insight I had that I shared with myself on video some other day recently, which was how one day I don't think property will be worth anything. People at some point will detach from feeling like they need to own a piece of land. People will probably travel light with some clothes, or maybe there's even clothes when they travel and they could just use whatever. And there's more like dorms to sleep inside out of the weather, or even sleeping outside. And people will be more wanderers. And this could take some time, but I see having a home of one's own and owning land kind of like a decorated prison, and then one has to pay for all that, and then one has to work to pay for all that, and it's just kind of a gong show. And that's something that I'm going to be experimenting with these next few months. Well, probably the next year, is living a little bit more like a wanderer, possibly. And I don't know what that'll look like. I'm thinking it might look like going to California, and then when I come back to my home on native land, I will perhaps wander around a little bit and not live in one spot, live with different people, live in different communities possibly, and then perhaps next winter I will try to travel internationally again, maybe somewhere warm, and maybe the year after that I'll go like to European countries or something. I don't know. What I need to do is reduce the amount of vitamins I'm taking, so I'm not carrying a big thing of vitamins. And yeah, so going through my next crisis and seeing how I can minimize that when in a good environment, because it'll probably happen December, January, but I'm not afraid of it. But I totally got off topic here. What I was trying to say was, I was just saying to this person, I think one day, could be in 20 years, could be in 100 or 200 years, I don't know, that land value will be nearly worthless. And because we'll all share the land, we won't say I own this one little piece. So anyway, he made some comments about that. It wasn't, I don't know, we just had a little discussion about that. And then I brought out my book, and I was just saying, oh, like I filled this notebook and a couple others like that in the last couple of months. And he said, can I see it? And I was like, and he just was saying, I just want to open it to a page. He said, that's usually what I do, is just open a book to a page and see what it is. So he was laying down like this, and he just went like this. And then he said, okay, read the page. And I marked the page now with the little string in the book. The string wasn't in the book there, it was at the end, but I put the string, and the very page that he opened up to, perhaps 5 minutes after me mentioning that insight I had about how land won't be worth anything in terms of personal ownership, the page that he opened to was so the page that he opened to said, "I realized one day personal property will have no value. You won't live in one personal prison. Property value will drop with technology. We must learn to wander with love, immune to thought." So I just started laughing out loud because it was so funny to me that that happened. And when I was in California last year, it would happen that way, that I had something come to mind regarding what I was studying. I'd pick a book off the shelf and open it, and it would say that exact thing. So things start happening in reverse. They arise in mind, and then it's immediately there in manifestation. And the odds of that happening are so small. So what are the odds that he would open to that very statement that I've only written in that book one time? And that's the one that I just said. So it was funny because it was the same sort of thing, saying something and then opening a book, but somebody else opened the book for me, and it still happened that way. So it just shows me that that person is sort of like resonant. Obviously, if they can do that same thing that I did in isolation with them being there. And I'll talk about more stuff later. Another double rainbow. Wow, what a rainbow. What a double rainbow. How beautiful. And it was there right when I went out the door. And then it disappeared shortly thereafter. And then I was driving, and the cars coming in the other lane, the rainwater coming off the tires produced a rainbow too. So it almost looked like the cars were driving through rainbow power, or a rainbow was propelling the vehicle, or the vehicles were manifesting from a rainbow. And it looks so cool and magical. And anyway, I'm at my destination. Just wanted to share a little bit of the magic. Finally got a coffee. I'm dressed a little too warm for this weather, but it was cold and rainy the last few days. This morning I sorted out all the medications I'll need for my trip, and I also sorted out some baggies of a few days of vitamins because I don't want to be reaching into the 30 vials of vitamins that I have when I'm on the road trip portion of getting there. So I did that, and that took some time. I had to make some capsules out of glycine powder, and that's all organized. And then I stopped and got another 150 American dollars. Have a bit of that. So the little bits that I do every day will lead me to be prepared when I leave in less than 2 weeks. And I'm just doing a bit of walking before I head to work. Hi, Squirrely. The other thing I forgot to mention was last night, I think I slept 12 or 13 hours, which I haven't done in a while, but I guess I needed it. Maybe not exactly, but I didn't have to wake up this morning, so I just kept sleeping, and when I got up it was 10:47. It's a beautiful day, so I'm out for a walk on my favorite trail in this area, and it's a quiet Tuesday morning, and I woke up feeling rather tired in my eyes. I didn't have the greatest sleep. Felt like I was kind of awake while sleeping part of the night, and my eyes were feeling tired even walking on this trail. And I finally saw someone walking towards me, and they said good morning, so I said good morning. And I've noticed that just that one little good morning made my eyes feel just a little bit better. And it came to mind how oftentimes as human beings we feel like we need each other or we depend on somebody, but it's a little bit of a different perspective to feel like we are each other. We don't need each other, we are each other. And so then things are based on love thy neighbor as thyself, as opposed to everything that's based on right now. So as I said, I didn't have the greatest sleep. If I don't sleep well tonight, I will stop taking the tyrosine and the methylators and probably not have coffee tomorrow. If I don't sleep well tonight, I'll probably take an extra quarter of Zopicone as well, just to get a really good sleep. Because I'm finding that's key, and there's something to wanting to be happy and manic and go into that crazy, wonderful, dreamlike, awake world of magic and synchronicity and the perfection of one's life. And then there's another way of sleeping as much as one can. Oh, there's a fly on my finger. Sleeping as much as one can in order to avoid spending so much time in this consensus world. And by doing that, spending as little time in it as possible, then one can stay in it longer. It's kind of strange. These two boxes, this one's half full of notebooks, and it has other papers that I've, like some creations down there, and then this one's full of notebooks. And I think those are only from 2015 onward, maybe. I wrote a huge stack of papers when I was first manic, but I recycled them and I scanned them. Could have kept the stack though. I was just walking in the park, and now I'm walking along the road because up ahead on the trail I saw a bear. And I would have stayed in the park and just walked the trail the other way, but the bear had a cub. So I turned around and there were two other guys there, and we both found an exit onto the road just to be safe. I don't need to fool around with a mama bear and a cub. So I've never walked this way before. I've never walked on the outside of the park, so it'll be a new experience.
time to go the other way. Oh, they have that one has cubs. We better get out of here. It has a baby, so we better get out. I think.
Couldn't go out there.
Yeah, because that's when they're aggressive, when they have babies.
Okay.
I'm probably gonna get out of the park just to be safe.
Yeah. So we just pass over them?
I'm gonna walk this way.
Yeah.
Bye.
Last night I slept better. I slept about 12 hours, and I'm wondering if this is partly because last night and 2 nights ago I took a cap of branched chain amino acids. And that's something that I learned from Dr. Peter Smith, to take 20 to 40 grams. And that's something I learned from Dr. Peter Smith of balancingbrainchemistry.co.uk. He said take 20 to 40 grams of branched chain amino acids in the event of a manic emergency. I don't really get manic emergencies, so I figured I'd try it because he said, well, the branched chain amino acids do. They sort of help do the opposite of tyrosine, which is, tyrosine is a precursor for dopamine. And the branched chain amino acids supposedly draw the dopamine out of the brain, or maybe it draws the tyrosine out of the brain, I don't know. And basically it diverts it to building muscle. So I took a cap of it. I don't know how much that is per se. It might only be 1 gram, which is a lot less than 40 grams. I use my empty taurine capsules because I've been putting the 4,000 milligrams of taurine into water. But it might be more than a gram capsule, I don't know, because there could be fillers in the taurine. But I took 1 cap, which is about a gram, and I slept really well. I did have some vivid dreams. I did have the weird thing where I was seeing something and a dream sort of woke me up. I saw, it was like I was driving and I saw a red car cut in front of me, and then I hit that car, I think. That guy said hi to me, and he said, I didn't even see you, I was daydreaming. I didn't see him because my phone was in the way. So I'm wondering if that helped me sleep, because that could be a strategy. Maybe I'll be able to take less sleeping stuff if I take a little bit of branched chain amino acids. They taste disgusting, so putting them in a capsule is handy. So I have to remember to bring those because I keep them in the fridge here. So learning more about these strategies and adapting them to myself, because he has the strategy of taking methylfolate or SAM-E in an emergency. And right now I'm taking 200 milligrams of SAM-E daily and a methylfolate daily, and I think it makes me feel better. If I felt really low, I would take more SAM-E, and I have the uridine and inositol and different things. So I started reading a bit of the Dirty Genes book again, because it talks about 5 or 6 major single nucleotide polymorphisms and the effect they can have Of course, there's probably hundreds or thousands, but they've identified some key ones. And I did have genetic testing years ago when I was trying to sort this out biologically. And I don't have a dirty SNP or of MTHFR, which is common for people with bipolar. But according to this book, it could be acting dirty, even though it's a clean SNP. There's no SNP. There's no single nucleotide polymorphism, not in either copy of the gene for me, but could still be acting up. There could be still something up with my methylation cycle. Years ago, I did have the homocysteine level checked in my body, and it was high. And by reading this book, I'm understanding it a little bit better. How B9 is needed, which is I think it's methylfolate or folate, but folic acid is the wrong supplementation. So I think by getting rid of the folic acid in my diet, not having as much rice, that's been probably helpful. So I'm seeing the connection by reading this Dirty Genes book, and the only gene that I have that is dirty or has a SNP is COMT, C-O-M-T. And so I can't really figure out if it's going slow or fast with that SNP, but has lots to do with magnesium and craving coffee, which I usually do, but I was able to quit for months last year when I was in California. So yeah, I'm gonna try and look into that stuff more because it's really fascinating, and it's fascinating how much methylation is needed for. It says something like 200 processes, including creating phosphatidylcholine out of choline, and that's needed for creating new cell walls. And if one thinks about neuroplasticity as needing to create new brain cells or cells, then one needs more cell walls for sure. So phosphatidylcholine, something about bile. It's quite interesting actually. Methylating something to make carnitine, which is needed for fat metabolism. So yeah, I'm gonna keep looking into this, researching more, because biology does play a role, probably a bigger role than anything else, because the self isn't really real. I think depending on what biology we have, it will determine how we use words. Do words use us, or are we able to use words? And one of the things that I have access to is new words and new ways of using words. So I think that's really important. So yeah, looking into the biochemistry of it, and I don't know, maybe I will study nutrition one day, because studying the self is kind of silly when you think about it, because there is no self. And the thing is to negate the self, and Krishnamurti teaches that through negation comes the positive. So negating all the aspects of the self, that which is other than the self, which is love, will come into being. We don't even know what love is. Love is the unknown, so we must negate the known. So, and it's not, I think it can be negated and finally negated, and one lives in a field of love. And that's something completely different. One might not even be aware of the self and its aspects. Just living in that world of love. Because the game isn't to negate until one dies. It's to negate until one can create in that field of love. So looking at the biochemistry, because looking at the self is like looking at nothing. Physicality is something, and it could be by changing very few molecules, like orthomolecular, different words and different perception and experience comes into being, and it's pretty simple. I saw a kid at the park earlier, little baby, I don't know how old, probably 4 to 6 months. Couldn't really sit up too much on its own, and he was really big. He was a big baby. He looked like he was wearing boxer shorts that were for an 8 or 10-year-old. Its waist was really big. And I was thinking about how it seems like that switch to create bigger bodies is there in general and create less brain cells.
Okay, that doesn't count. That does not. You didn't play it up.
Anyways, I'm feeling kind of blah because I ate McDonald's fries for the first time since I can remember. I might have not had them more than once in the last 7 years. But it was pouring rain. I didn't have a chance to eat before work, and I was really hungry after work. And I didn't want to get out of the car, and the only drive-through around was McDonald's. So I got fries and a strawberry banana smoothie, but I'm feeling kind of like, ooh. I can feel like anxiety a bit, and maybe because my thought process has been released in terms of, why did I eat that? I'm sure most of us think that after eating McDonald's. And I went through the drive-thru and I said, what are your vegetarian options? And she said, 1 sec, let me ask. She didn't even know. And she came back with, we have French fries and Big Mac without meat and cheeseburger without meat. And I thought at least they'd have some kind of vegetarian wrap or something. But they also said they had salads and you could just not have the chicken. Can't really eat a salad while I'm driving. So yeah, that was that. And yeah, now I'm just feeling kind of fidgety after eating that, since I haven't had it in so long, really noticing how it's making me feel. And ooh, so I think had I had some nuts and seeds, I would have been able to manage. But when I don't have enough snacks, this is what happens. And yeah, I'm going to take some oil of oregano once that gets a little bit digested, and hopefully that helps to mitigate some of the awful effects of that. So I don't really know what to talk about, partly because I don't know if I feel like talking that much anymore. I feel like I might get into writing. I don't know. Last night I felt like watching some Downton Abbey, and I haven't done that for a while, so I watched 2 episodes, and I stayed up until a bit after 12, and then slept until 11, so that was nice. And yesterday I was doing a bit of reading in the book Dirty Jeans, and I was reading the chapter on methylation, and it was really interesting because this book is about how certain genes can be dirty genes, in quotes, meaning there could be some kind of genetic single nucleotide polymorphism, which leads them to be sort of sluggish or fast. And the methylation chapter is about the gene MTHFR. And I know I don't have that as a single nucleotide polymorphism, but from what I read, it seems like my gene wasn't necessarily born dirty, but it's acting dirty. Meaning that if there's a certain amount of toxic buildup, etc., then it can still act sluggish. And I remember years ago I had my homocysteine levels checked, and it was at 12. And this book says it shouldn't be any higher than 7. And I'm not sure what my levels are at now, because they said now, oh, we don't test for that anymore. But from reading this chapter, I learned a little bit about what might have been going on there. So the chapter on MTHFR said that that gene, MTHFR, passes a methyl group to folate, which makes methylfolate. Right now I'm supplementing with methylfolate. And methylfolate plus homocysteine, so methylfolate gives a methyl group to homocysteine, which then creates methionine. So it's possible that if I had high homocysteine, that I didn't have enough methylfolate to methylate homocysteine to methionine. That's part of what possibly could have been happening. And it's possible I didn't have enough methylfolate because I didn't have enough folate, or it could have been because the MTHFR gene wasn't working properly. And my naturopath tested me for that SNP, as it's called, and he saw that I didn't have that as a SNP. So he never told me to take methylfolate, though I am taking it now, which I learned from Dr. Peter Smith and also Dr. Mercola. I've just heard it from a few sources recently that folic acid isn't good. It's kind of artificial folate, and it blocks this whole process. And I was taking folic acid at some point, and I probably was taking B12 with folic acid at some point. So I could have been taking a B12 that had folic acid that was messing with this whole first step of methylfolate methylating homocysteine to methionine. So I'd be interested to find out at some point if I have high homocysteine by going to a naturopath or something. So I'm taking the methylfolate now, which could be making up for the MTHFR gene not working properly. But that it's a cycle, so that's not the only place where it could have been messed up. So then there's more of a pathway after homocysteine to methionine, a pathway of genes and enzymes and things like that. And then it said, finally, the methyl group forms S-adenosylmethionine, which is actually SAMe. So that's the end product of that cycle. And I'm taking SAMe now. So right now I'm taking the beginning product, methylfolate, which methylates homocysteine to eventually create SAMe, and I'm taking some SAMe. So maybe I'm overdoing it taking both, but I feel better taking a little bit of SAMe and taking some methylfolate. And this book warns against taking SAMe prematurely, and it can be not so great for bipolar from what I've read. But my naturopath did tell me, the one I saw years ago, he did tell me to take a little bit of SAMe. But I'm thinking this methylfolate is helping because I needed to push the homocysteine on as well. So it's SAMe, which ultimately passes methyl groups onto the 200 functions or processes that need them. So I didn't realize before reading this the other day how important SAMe is. And generally our body makes that. So after SAMe has passed on its methyl groups, it becomes homocysteine again. So this is where I also feel I could have formed too much homocysteine, is that whatever SAMe I was forming, I was passing on those methyl groups to other processes and forming homocysteine. So it's like a double whammy or a double SAMe in a way that I think my body needs a lot of methylation because of all the stuff I've talked about with myself about this neurofluidity. It says there's 200 functions or processes that need the methyl groups from SAMe. In a brain that's really neurofluid, more so than neuroplastic, one could need even more methyl groups because that's something that is really an epigenetic switch. There could be even more in a brain that is mutating in a way. So homocysteine is an end product of methylation and the beginning. So I feel that it's possible that maybe MTHFR isn't a dirty gene SNP in me. It could just be that I need even more methyl groups. So maybe MTHFR is making methylfolate, but it's so quickly going to homocysteine and going through that whole cycle to form SAMe that it's so quickly back at homocysteine, and that was piling up, and I was at 12. And this book, which is a more recent book, says a person should be at no more than 7. So I do want to check that again, because that would give some indication. And of course there are other factors, so that isn't the only thing. And this book advocates for eating a lot of leafy greens and nuts and seeds, and and nutritional things that would up these processes. I've been using the supplement thing because I haven't had a kitchen to fully support myself to make super healthy food. So I have been doing the supplement thing. I just ate McDonald's fries today and I'm feeling it. So even though I was able to eat Subway, Mucho Burrito, and lots of different things, I think my body's drawing the line at McDonald's. It's saying, don't do that again. Don't eat those fries again. And I'd like to be able to negate and be immune to all these bad things in reality. And one day I'll be able to, but right now I think my body's like, no, McDonald's, you can't. You can't not believe that that's good for you, or you can't not believe that that's bad for you. It's just gross and bad. And there's no way to dispute that, even with the power of consciousness, at least not at this moment. And then other things that I talked about in terms of methylation is that folate, which is B9, is methylfolate when methylated. And one also needs methylcobalamin, which is B12. So all these things are methyl, like homocysteine goes to methionine with the methyl group. And so if B9 or B12 are deficient, then that gets screwed up too. And like I mentioned, I was taking B12 with folic acid for a while, so that could have messed up the methylfolate, the B9. And you know, they fortify food with folic acid, and I think it's kind of done on purpose to mess up our methylation cycle so our brain can't grow and heal and methylate all the processes and genes and enzymes that it needs to in order to work properly. So and another thing that it needs is riboflavin, which is B2, and choline, interestingly enough, which I can't remember where that fits exactly, but it's important. Well, I think it was because choline forms phosphatidylcholine when it's methylated, and that's needed for cell membranes. So in order to grow new brain cells, we need cell membranes. And so methylation is really important for that. So learning how important methylation is. And that's just one little aspect of the book. And I did talk before about how I do have a SNP, a single nucleotide polymorphism in COMT, C-O-M-T gene. So there are so many different levels to explore this stuff on. And I think these genetic switches are really important by being healthy and stuff like that. And I haven't yet been super healthy while I've been talking to myself for the last 2 years. For the first year I was eating a lot of rice, which is fortified in folic acid, which would mess up methylation. So it's important to keep learning and growing and not give up. And yeah, I've made a lot of other notes too, but you know, some of them are around language, and let me look. Something else that has inspired me to maybe focus more on writing is that I listened to a webinar with Stephen Kotler, who's someone I mildly follow in that he talks about flow states. And I read his book and Jamie Wheel's book, Stealing Fire. So I wanted to listen to his webinar on writing because I don't really know much about writing as a craft, and he talks about it in that way. So he talked about elements of writing that I've never thought about that way before. But it's interesting because he talks about rhetoric, and I don't know that much about rhetoric in terms of theory or as a study. And he's talking about certain factors of rhetoric like alliteration which is using like a similar sound, like L's a lot and things like that. And he talks about one called hyperbation, scrambling word order. And when we do that, when the brain unscrambles it, then somebody gets a shot of dopamine, and hyperbole, which is apparently exaggeration. So I feel like people who get really connected with writing in bipolar and write in metaphor and use alliteration and poetry and so many different things, like all these elements that he's talking about in this webinar, I related to in terms of how that's how I naturally would write when in an energetic state. But the point he made was that if you use it too much, you'll drive your readers crazy. And I thought of this even in terms of how when we use it too much when we're writing to ourselves or writing something from that creative space, it drives us crazy to write that way, to use words in that way all the time, to be in this state of speaking in terms of metaphor and poetry and simile and alliteration and pointing out patterns between things that other people can't necessarily see. So we're in that state in terms of how words flow through us or how we use words. And then that also leads us to be in this higher energetic state. And it could be the trouble of using words like that all the time that drives us crazy. So for example, and this is something he talks about later. So I'm only talking about this not to share what Stephen Kotler says about writing, but I'm sharing it to extrapolate it to what happens to people in so-called bipolar, where sometimes we can't stop writing. And it could be that we can't stop writing and that we're writing with these rhetorical type ways of writing without even knowing it. So he talks about the flowers of rhetoric, which is persuasion. I don't really like the word persuasion. I think that a lot of the rhetoric, and I'm going to call it in a way bipolar rhetoric, we're seeing something, we're seeing patterns. So he talks about how dopamine detects patterns and gets a squirt when they're violated. So in so-called mania, we do detect a lot of patterns, and we also when we detect new patterns, a lot of times those patterns contraindicate or negate or write over old patterns that we used to take for granted. So that's a way that we could be getting a really big dopamine boost through having these different language structures operating in our brains and writing in that way and speaking in that way, to the point where we're speaking so fast that other people can't understand us. So it could be also safer to write it as opposed to say it to other people. So in this way, one can figure out different strategies and use language in a consensus way in day-to-day reality and do writing in this sort of bipolar rhetoric. And I'm calling it bipolar rhetoric because, like I said, all these things that he was sort of pointing out as factors of writing rhetorically, we naturally use. It would be like a type of poetic rhetoric. And it's not for persuasion, but it's to see if other people can see what we're seeing, because we are writing based on what we're seeing, which is using language in a different way. And it gets kind of fun to like make up poetic lines or alliteration or exaggeration or swapping words around or spelling things in a different way or using them in a different context. But maybe the point isn't that we can do that and letting it get out of hand, but the point could possibly be that since we're writing in this really rhetorical way, that we're trying to show something to somebody or to ourselves. We're trying to say to ourselves what we're seeing. But it could also be an indication that maybe we are supposed to communicate something to other people if we have access to this type of rhetoric. So learning how to master that could be interesting. And I was struck by this article in Common Ground magazine called Hard to be a Saint in the City, The Spiritual Vision of the Beats. So I learned about the Beat Generation when I watched a movie about some guy from the Beat Generation. I can't remember his name now. And then there was this article in the Beat Generation, about the Beat Generation in Common Ground. And it's really interesting how it talks about, the whole article is interesting, and how people don't take this form of writing seriously from the Beat Generation people. You know, it says self-invented bop spontaneous prose, a jazz-inspired meld of improvisation and stream of consciousness. So, yeah, it's a really good article, and I think that we as bipolar people have access to this too. And it could have even been like, did bipolar really even exist back when these Beat people were doing their thing, which was, I think, like the 50s and 60s? I don't know for sure, but it's almost like these people got access to this way of writing, like improvisation. And I've talked about die and provolog as a way of communicating and gesturing. And it's almost as if the mainstream was like, well, let's call these people bipolar and label them with a mental illness instead of letting them run wild and almost create a new culture in a way, or have an influence on culture. And it says here, for example, it says these two guys provided the vocabulary and conceptual framework for the very idea of a Beat generation. So I don't want to just read over the article because it's by Robert Inshausti, who wrote this article, Hard to be a Saint in the City, which sort of resonates with bipolar people. Sometimes we get connected with this spirituality, but it's impossible to uphold it around all of this like civilization that we have. And I do feel that it's possible that part of our role is to change the culture through the rhetoric that we get access to by seeing a different dimension, seeing through the conditioned structures of society, seeing the meaning behind it all. And so just listening to Stephen Kotler made me realize, wow, we have this sort of bipolar rhetoric, but it goes into overload, and that bipolar rhetoric might be one mode of speaking and communicating, and we still need to maintain our mode of the self, and of storytelling, and of thought, and of all the other different language structures and tenses, present, past, future tense, command tense. We need to still have access to these other tenses. And how is it that we can write in order to like teleport people into our way of seeing through our use of language? And there could be a way to work on that, because as I see it, we already have access to it, but when we don't know what it really is, then it can get out of control. And, you know, partly, well, I don't need to go into that, but yeah, so I made quite a few notes on what he was saying. He talked about a way of writing that when people solve the puzzle, they get a squirt of dopamine. So there could be a way to write in a bit of a less puzzling way, so people can actually solve the puzzle of what we're writing instead of being completely bewildered by it. So sort of toning down what we do and not doing it the whole time in our writing. And also, he just gave some other tips for things. And he said people's attention span on average is 8 to 9 seconds. That's frightening. And I feel like what he shared and how it relates to dopamine is partly a way that we can understand how dopamine gets so boosted in the brain. So one of the ways to prevent that, like for me, it even happens for me if I spend too much writing for a number of days, like it kind of implodes my brain. Even when I was on the island, when I look at my spire breathing and how much time I spent in focused breathing, like 2 hours a day as opposed to like 15 minutes. I was doing, too much studying and too much writing, and it didn't really give my brain a chance to get that dopamine out of my brain. So then I just write some blah blah whatever. So let me see what else I got here. So for example, he said that the brain likes 3 bits of information at a time, or 4, because we have limited working memory. And sometimes I feel like in my writing, I could write really, really long paragraphs without a period or something. And maybe that's just too long for a reader that is using working memory in order to read. One might suggest not reading to even try to put it into working memory. So it could also be, for what I'm talking about, is suggesting that people read in a completely different way. Not to remember, but read in a stream of consciousness way. We think of writing in a stream of consciousness way, but we don't necessarily think of reading in a stream of consciousness way by just reading and allowing some other faculty to do the understanding than conditioned thought. And so he says the rule of 3 in speaking and writing: to convince, to believe. Well, I don't think one needs to convince anybody of anyone. It's more like, can you see with your own eyes? And then you don't need any convincing. So to me, the whole mechanism of belief is kind of erroneous. But anyway, he also implies that it's obnoxious to use big words. And sometimes in bipolar, I think we can use big words sometimes, or I do making up of words, of my own words, and sometimes they're big words, so that's even more obnoxious. So reading these little tips is helpful somewhat to know. And I just have some of my own stuff mixed in with that. The other part that I wanted to get to was that anyway, what I was writing to myself about what he was saying was something slightly different, which is often what I do, because when people are writing from a certain perspective of self, I often extrapolate it to something different. So for me, for example, when I read stuff, oftentimes my brain extrapolates to something new automatically, like creates 10 times the information from reading one sentence. So if one could write in such a way that all of a sudden at some point a person's brain was doing that, they now have that capacity activated and they could write their own book from reading just a few lines of someone else's, and it would be completely new and original. So it would be writing in such a way to get the brain to the immediate action of extrapolation, not reading for comprehension. And that's, I guess he was talking about, Stephen Kotler was talking a little bit about that in terms of reading like a writer. So that wouldn't be reading for comprehension, it's reading in a way possibly for, I don't remember what he said, but for me it would probably be something even more beyond, which is extrapolation. being able to the brain cells immediately act to extrapolate and create more than was there, and it's original and new. It could be almost completely unrelated to that thing. So another thing that interests me about what he writes is he talks about transient hypofrontality, which is the prefrontal cortex shutting down, and that is one of the initial conditions for flow to happen, is for the prefrontal cortex to shut down. So why would we want the prefrontal cortex, which is like the thing we say is the most amazing evolutionary thing in the world in terms of the human brain, this prefrontal cortex? The best part of it happens when we're in flow, when that shit shuts down. And that's what I've said to myself a lot. And it needs to shut down in order for flow to happen, because the prefrontal cortex is the sense of willpower, logical, complex decision making, long-term planning, sense of morality, which is all like, it's all preconceived. It's all preconceived. It's all old. It's all conditioned. So for something new to happen, everything that we've preconceived of, that has been conditioned into us, needs to shut down temporarily. So I think in bipolar, this hypofrontality happens for a longer period of time. And if it could be possible that if more of us were able to be hypofrontal more often, then it wouldn't have to be out of control in some people. Can we control our hypofrontality in a way? And it could be that the thing I've been thinking about is, a new level of language, or a new tense of language, a new way of using language, which isn't about the self at all. And that could actually be a type of hypofrontal language, and a type of hypofrontal action, because I think the prefrontal cortex is the seat of the self, and there's so much to that, but language is a big part of that. So all those things are part of the self. And he even said self is all over the prefrontal cortex, and it's a huge network, and we lose the ability to sense the self when we're hypofrontal. And it's so big what they're saying here, yet it's not extrapolated to what happens to people when they lose their sense of self in like a so-called mental health crisis. But I feel like we can learn to act in a hypofrontal way, and we can learn to speak in a hypofrontal way. Then we don't have to worry about this self and how it's innervated all over the prefrontal cortex. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about that he eventually gets to is that it's not that. I don't need to talk about that. But it's something about how like dopamine spikes at about 20 minutes. So after that, that's almost a little too much. Now think about how in bipolar our brain is soaked in dopamine for probably days and weeks and months possibly. And it's saying here that, 20 minutes. So that's why he said, TED Talks are 20 minutes long. But what I was thinking was, this is a good tip for people with bipolar. Don't do any type of bipolar crazy writing for more than 20 minutes. Because after that, for us, dopamine's probably going to get too high. He was saying that dopamine kind of runs out, and then people are like kind of tired and they can't handle any more information. But people with bipolar know that we can go on with dopamine for days and months and weeks and things like that. and it's not necessarily a way to stay grounded in so-called consensus reality. So, do the bipolar rhetoric stuff 20 minutes a day, and maybe it's good to do 20 minutes a day to get the brain used to that amount of dopamine, and then sort of shutting off. So that way, if one did that, a practice of 20 minutes of bipolar writing a day, one would get a sense of, okay, how do I feel when that's enough dopamine, like the 20 minutes of regular dopamine that is sort of the max for so-called normal people. What does that feel like? So then one could maybe learn when to dial back if the dopamine spikes at another time in the day. So like that could be a way to learn that, because one of the ways we do get the most hyped up is through writing, which is part of perceiving. So yeah, again, the webinar was really good, and I don't want to talk about all of it because I just wanted to talk about those few things. And then I started writing a little bit as a result of that. So then I wrote something to Steve Pavlina as a result of reading some of that, or listening to this webinar, and I don't know if I want to read that. It probably won't come across very good because usually when I read stuff it's kind of like blah 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 blah. But yeah, I'll see if I want to read that or not.